Hello, good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday to you. Today's Training Tuesday, we're going to be discussing communications with vendors. Many times you guys will get questions from vendors. What can and can't you say if a vendor calls or emails? We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about reportable communications. And in the code, what talks about reportable communications, what does need to be reported, what does not need to be reported. There's a handy dandy tool on the PPB website where you can report communications. So we'll be discussing like that. And then we'll also get into a page from our specifications training discussing the terms shall, must, may, should, when those are appropriate to be used and when not to, when they shouldn't be used, and just a couple kind of best practices. And then we'll finish up with our quote of the day. All right, so first up, communications. Okay, so this comes specifically from 5039 in the procurement code. And I'm going to read this. I'll break it up in little bits and pieces, and we'll kind of discuss as we move through here. So any written or oral communication. So it doesn't matter whether it's a phone call, an email, they stop by your office. Any written or oral communication received by a state employee who, by the nature of his or her duties, has the authority to participate personally and substantially in the decision to award a state contract. Okay, so let me stop right there for a second. Spoiler alert, that's all of us. Okay, so we are state employees by the nature, have the authority to participate in the decision to award a state contract. Okay, so doesn't matter if it's written, doesn't matter if it's oral, and it's all of us. Okay, and that imparts or requests material information or makes a material argument regarding potential action concerning an active procurement matter. Okay, so now let's take that and break that bit into more sizable chunks here. Okay, request material information or makes a material argument. So material argument is also defined and material information. And we have the link in here so you can kind of go in and do a little bit more digging on this if you have specific questions. But material argument means a communication that a reasonable person would believe was made for the purpose of influencing a decision relating to a procurement matter. Again, that comes from 5039. So what's an example of this, right? So a vendor calls or emails and says, hey, I'd really like for you to change that specification. That should, if you changed this, we'd be responsive. Or I think, hey, buyer Dave, I think when you write that spec, you should include this. That is
available
exactly.
at the tone.
Okay. So that is that material argument is that communication. So many times a vendor will call you and we just want you to be empowered to be able to know, first of all, that you wouldn't respond to that and what you can say. But then that is a reportable communication. And we have a question here. Does that include all state employees, even end users, that doesn't deal with the award? So the end users, yes, that would be a reportable communication because you are that state employee is receiving that communication from the vendor. So, like I said, hey, would I be responsive if I submitted this? Or I'd like for you to change this specification. Or next time if you're working on in the middle of that, and hey, why don't you add this spec to it? When you write that spec, you should add this. So that is a potential action concerning an active procurement matter. Okay, so now let's add that to active procurement matter. Active procurement matter, that starts whenever the agency determines the need. Okay, so it doesn't mean, well, that clock starts once we've published a solicitation. That active procurement matter, that clock starts on as soon as the agency identifies that need. And that's important to understand too, because when that clock starts, that kicks in a bunch of other, kicks in the reportable communications. It also, brings up other ethical type issues, right? Where we can't tell the vendor community or tell anybody that, the solicitation is going to be coming out next week, right? We can't say anything like that. So that active procurement matter. So now that's not talking about something on a previous contract, or you have a vendor that is, you're discussing something on a current contract. That's different. This is the material argument, material information. They impart or request that regarding potential action concerning an active procurement matter. So I did want to really zero in on that active procurement matter, because I think there can be some confusion or misunderstanding of when that clock starts. So it starts all the way back, the justification, or where the agency identifies that need. So it doesn't matter when it's been awarded, or it doesn't matter if it's been published or not. That is an active procurement matter. So we want to be aware of that. So including but not limited to an application, a contract, or a project shall be reported to the Procurement Policy Board. So if that occurs, if you do receive that communication, we have a link here. You click on there. There's a tool on the PPB's website that it walks you through what is required. Now, 5039 also goes into what is required. There are some fields that you complete that are who received the communication, where the communication came from. Was it a phone call? Was it an email? How long was there are certain questions that are required by code, but this tool on the PPB's website just takes care of that. So, and if you ever have any specific questions about this too, so like we're also going to get into, what you can and can't say to a vendor. And so there are some, what does not need to be reported. So let's move on to that first in our next slide, and then we'll see if we have any other additional questions. Let's see, here's a good question. If we are contacted and asked to change something by a vendor, can that vendor be disqualified from bidding? I'll answer the question, can they? Yes, they can. They potentially could be a prohibited bidder in that scenario. That's going to be, each case will be slightly different. And so that's going to be one of, the specifics of that you would need to discuss with your APO and your SPO. But the answer to that is yes. They potentially could be a prohibited bidder. So let's move to what does not need to be reported. Sometimes this can inform and clarify some situations. So first off, statements made in a public forum do not need to be reported. Here's probably one of our most common ones that you guys will see. So statements regarding procedure and practice. So vendor calls up and says, I got an email regarding this HVAC procurement or whatever. What's the bid number on that? Procedure and practice, a bid by question. How do I fill out this form? The manner of filing or the status of a matter, that also is in the code there as not being needed to be reported. So now the communication itself, let's talk about the status of a matter. You don't want to necessarily say, oh yeah, we're about to make that award. You don't say that. You would say something along the lines of, you're not avoiding the question. It's just many times the vendor community doesn't know what you can and can't tell them. And so I think just it's an opportunity for you to teach a vendor about some of our rules and regulations that we have in Illinois. And so you could say something along the lines of, that's currently being evaluated. We're not allowed to, tell you the specific status of it right now, but monitor bid buy for future communications regarding that award. Something like that. At that point, you're giving some knowledge to the vendor, and that'll help them in future procurements, whether it's with your agency or another agency too. Many times vendors will they just want to know, and they don't know what they don't know in terms of they might not understand that you can't tell them, oh yeah, we are reviewing this conflict of interest right now, but we're about to make this award or whatever. We don't want to share that information, right? But those other regarding procedure and practice questions, you can answer. And just as an overall just high level view here, painting with a broad brush. What other cliche can I say here? Um, if you don't know that you can or cannot answer that question, it's always safer to say, look, I appreciate the call or I appreciate the email. I'm not sure if I can answer that specific question right now. I'll get right back to you. That's absolutely appropriate. That's professional. We don't want to get in a scenario if you aren't sure. And so if you're not sure, just kind of pause and elevate that question to your APO or your SPO. And if there are other questions regarding where that fits, we'll make sure we get that answered for you. But many times we see is that's a very common thing. Where's Forms B, or a question about a form? Those sorts of things can be answered, and they do not need to be, it's not a reportable communications for what we're talking about. So any statement by a state employee to agency head, other agency employees, EEC employees, other agency employees involved in the procurement. So any of the discussions that we have amongst ourselves regarding a procurement as state employees for that procurement does not need to be reported. Unsolicited communications providing general information. You receive a spam email from a company. That does not need to be reported. Responses to solicitations. So we're asking the vendor community for so any communications involving the response to an RFP, an IFB, those sorts of things do not need to be reported. Now, that is not to say a question about one of those solicitations. This is just, this bullet point is specific to you're receiving technically that communication because that vendor is submitting a quote in bid buy, right? That's all this means right here. This isn't saying a question regarding a solicitation. So that'll be a little bit different. Okay, and then this is probably the other one that is super common, is a clarification regarding a solicitation, so long as there's no competitive advantage to the person or business and the questions and answers are posted in bid buy. So this is not regarding procedure or practice. This is a specific question about a specification. You would not answer that question just to that one vendor. You would receive that question. You would have them all answer, many times for these solicitations, questions are due by a certain date. Then all of the questions are compiled and answered by the subject matter experts or the procurement shop at your agency. Then all the questions and answers are posted publicly at one time via a bid amendment, and they're posted in bid buy. So that way, all the vendor community, they all have the same information. Again, that all goes back to the promoting competition, transparency, that are at the core of what we do. Okay, so if a vendor calls or emails you asking about a specification, something like that, you would not respond directly back to them. Okay, that is one where it's not a reportable communication, but it would be that communication would end up going out to all of our vendors at one time with the answers to all those questions. Okay, and that's been our common practice, but we're just circling back here for just for everybody's clarification on a couple of these things. So the most common ones I see here would be the regarding procedure or practice, as well as the clarification regarding solicitation that's put out as a question and answer posted in bid buy. And then again, we have the link to 5039 that you can go in and read a little bit more about that. All right, now let's transition to a specific piece in not specific piece, that's a bad joke. I think I say that too much. Specifications. Okay, so wording is important. So we're going to talk about ambiguous and vague terms, and then our should, shalls, mays, and musts. And so overall, and these are things that as an SPO, I'm on the lookout for. My antenna always goes up when I see words like normal or suitable or acceptable, timely, first class. I mean, there's a ton of these different things that we can all come up with. Preferable, because of course, your notion of acceptable might be completely different than mine, right? So we want to have a little bit more of a quantifiable terms whenever possible. So we want to be on the lookout for those. Many times we can figure out better ways to say these sorts of things. At the end of the day, it's all about how we can communicate better with our vendor community so they can give us pricing for what we need. Also, must, shalls, mays, and shoulds. Okay, so we want to review all those carefully. Is a must or a shall requiring something from the vendor community at the time of the quote submittal, or is it really something that is a contract term? So we want to review those, so make sure they're being used properly and appropriately and consistently throughout a solicitation. You know, we don't want something that's a may earlier on in a solicitation, and then something that's very much tied to it, a shall, that could just provide some confusion and then ends up being, you know, more vendor questions, potential protests, rebids, other delays, those sorts of things. Okay, so what do I mean when I say requiring something from the vendor community at time of bid, or is it a contract term? Many procurements will have something along the lines of, the example I like to use in these situations is like a licensed plumber. Having a licensed plumber is a perfectly reasonable specification to fix a plumbing issue, but saying vendors must provide proof at the time of quote they are a licensed plumber may be too restrictive, because it doesn't allow the opportunity for the vendor to provide more information prior to the award. So many times it's going to be a part of the contract. It's really important. We have another example here that we'll get on this slide, but thinking about those things, whether it is something that is a responsive element, is it something that can be checked up front, and could it be cured before we make an award? Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't, right? So every procurement is going to be slightly different. So shall and must. Okay, so these are mandatory verbiage. The vendors must meet these in order to be responsive. So this is one of those things. They either meet it or they don't, right? You see a lot of times on the check boxes and solicitations, it's met or not met. It's important to understand that these meet the agency's needs. These are not those that, you know, from an end user, yeah, we need this, but man, it'd sure be nice to have this too. That's a different thing. So that's going to get into a desirable. We have the difference between mandatories and desirables. Many times, too many mandatories will limit competition. So that's one of those things that, as an SPO and other procurement professionals, we're on the lookout for specifications that are too restrictive that do not allow for enough competition. So granted, every procurement is different. You certainly will have a lot of those, a lot of procurements will have a lot of mandatories, but the more mandatories you have, it just ticks up a little bit more of that risk that it's would limit competition. So, and many times I'll review and we'll see mandatories that are there that really could just be a contract requirement, because it's going to have to be a part of that contract. So when does that come into play? So we're talking about the all individuals must pass a background check in order to gain access to the state facility or building. Now, we're not going to do a back check. The state isn't going to do a back check on every vendor on the front end of a procurement. So really that is a contract requirement. So if the vendor was to be awarded, it's not a responsive element, but it is a requirement of the contract. So these are kind of interesting things. I know we're kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but it's important when we use words like shall and must, when it could be a may or should. Okay, so those are on the mandatory side, and then also the differentiation between a specification or a responsive element and a contract requirement. So now let's shift over to here's the example. So I already kind of mentioned this before, but vendor must be a licensed plumber. Okay. Now, vendor must provide proof they are a licensed plumber at time of bid. At that point, you're almost, you're asking for a vendor to forget to provide that, and then since they didn't provide it at time of bid, they are going to be deemed non-responsive. So it doesn't allow for that cure and might be too restrictive. So little things like that in the wording. Now, of course, we do need to confirm at some point that they are a licensed plumber, but maybe that's something that doesn't have to say at time of bid. Now, you might come up with a scenario that no, it really does need to be at time of bid, and those are the sorts of things that we discuss as procurement people. Okay, so now let's transition over to the shoulds and the mays. Should and may is a little bit more of the desirable type verbiage. We're talking about mandatories, met, not met, shall, must. Now we get into the desirables. So the question you can ask yourself is the agency evaluating and giving points based on a desirable? This is the, man, it sure be great if it could do this. We're gonna give points for this. And so, we're talking about RFP world now, right? The shoulds and the mays. Now we're kind of talking about should and may within the specification realm right now, right? And so if you're giving points based on those, that's probably a little bit more of what we're talking about. And so knowing the difference between a mandatory and a desirable is really important. And so that's why that communication is so important between the end user and in your procurement shop, because especially when there's a long list of specs, something that is this really a need, or is this just a, man, it'd be cool if we had this cool little bell and whistle, because that one little cool thing that's a mandatory could potentially disqualify a vendor for not providing that one little thing, when really it was just sure, it'd be cool if it could do this. And so we want to go over those with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that the shalls and the musts are in there, are used appropriately, as well as maybe that shall should be a should or a may. And then that's going to really help in terms of avoiding delays, protests, rebids, any other issues that might come up regarding these type of terms. Okay. So any questions on that? And of course, as always, anytime that you have specific questions regarding these sorts of things, those are the things that the SPOs are going to be looking out for. Okay, I have a question. Is it acceptable though to send back a thank you for your question? This will be included in a Q&A. Absolutely. Yep. So this is kind of going back to the reportable communications. That's okay. Essentially you're saying we received your question and your answer will be included in a Q&A. That is absolutely acceptable. Another question, where does the Q&A go? So that would be done as a bid amendment. As a part, you would attach a Word document or PDF that would have the question and the answer, so all vendors can see that. So that'd be done as a bid amendment. And so the agency, just as a quick reminder, agency completes or creates the bid amendment, but the SPO always applies that bid amendment. And so if you do, once you have your Q&A document ready to go, you receive all your questions and all your answers, you can attach that via bid amendment, then let your SPO know. And the reason why that is the SPO has to review, they have to approve all those bid amendments, but they also need to make sure that there's nothing in that question or answer that could potentially cause any other issues. So that's a part of that review process, and the SPO applying the bid amendment is them also approving. And then that's documented in bid by who applied that bid amendment. So remember, agency creates the bid amendment, but the SPO applies the bid amendment. Okay, let's see, another question. With regard to ambiguous terms, in RFPs, we want the ability to score a vendor solution based on these vague factors. So sometimes we like to include them. As you said, each procurement is different. Exactly. Yeah. And if the, I guess the ambiguous terms is everybody's going to have a slightly different acceptable. So yeah, acceptable. That's a vague term, right? Where they're kind of where their line is, what they're not going to allow. If you are providing points for those, then yeah, I think that's a great point. Each procurement is different, but if it's scoring, that's different. I think the point I was trying to make was putting in as a spec timely. Okay, well, we want somebody to come clean our office. Well, yeah, we want you to show up timely or an acceptable cleanliness. All right. My mom's cleanliness is going to be very much different than mine, right? So those are the sorts of things that I was really kind of trying to get into. But good point. Could we put shall or may provide proof? I'm not sure exactly where that is. Most of the time, it's either a shall or may. You know, the power of shall is very important. That's very clear. So I don't think we'd be in a scenario. I mean, I'm open to discussing it, or you can ask your SPO, but shall or may provide proof. I might need a little bit more explanation from you there. I guess this goes out to the group. Having trouble ordering vehicles off the Sutton Ford Master FY22 orders were both canceled. Has anyone successfully procured vehicles and have them delivered for FY23? I'm unaware of that, but maybe if somebody else sees that chat, they might be able to reach out and help you. I'll see what I can do on that end and get back to you. All right. Our last slide is where you can find our Training Tuesday and our Bid Buy training links. And then our quote of the day. I love Seneca, a Stoic philosopher. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. So it's funny how the most prepared people have a lot of luck. It's because they put in the time and effort to be ready to meet opportunity if you're prepared. So I love that one. All right, thanks everybody. The recording will be posted to the Training Tuesday page, and the slides will be sent out to everybody on the call. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your week.